Aynen. İki araştırma. Ha, öğrenci sayısı. Aslında ağırlık kullanabiliriz ya. Sen de öğrenci sayısı geldin değil mi? Burçan ne? Ha tamam, Burçan yazsın. Patronu şimdi yanlış bir şey yapıyor. Başlayayım mı ben? Denge. Burçan'ı bekleyeyim. Ben Teams falan başladım o yüzden. Şurada bir şey var. Yok, kağıt var.
Seminer dersi kapsamında.
Aynen. Ya seminer, evet aslında ilginçtir seminer dersi, normalde seminer. Aslında genelde öğrencilerin verdiği seminer oluyor ama biz şey de yapıyoruz yani. Ama ya. Tamam. Ha, okey. Tamamdır. Okay. Deniz Kerimoğlu, who is a close friend of mine, received his PhD degree in electrical and electronics engineering from Bilkent University. So we were technically as a part of the same research group called REX Research Group, led by Uluç Saranlı, Arşiv Saranlı, Ömer Morgül, and Yiğit Yazıcıoğlu. After finishing his PhD, he was a postdoc in Smart System Lab at Texas A&M University at Qatar between 2019 and 2021. Okay. Later, he joined one of the best biorobotics laboratories in the world, which is Complex Rheology and Biomechanics Lab at Georgia Institute of Technology, led by Professor Dan Goldman. And currently, he conducts research studies as a research scientist. His research focuses on discovering principles of robotic locomotion on complex terrains by developing novel approaches and terrain manipulation methods. And it will be glad for me.
Thanks for showing up, guys. So I'll be talking about robotics today, a little bit of physics, because I'm in the School of Physics department, and then more robotics. And I'll start off with why we do what we do by just giving a glimpse of dry granular media. That is a model substrate for soil-like terrains. And the definition is basically collection of particles that interact through dissipative, repulsive contact forces. You probably know from like beaches and stuff that you walk like when you take a vacation. And basically that kind of terrain provides quite rich behavior, and it's relatively simple and it's quite representative. And depending on the force you apply, when you walk on such terrains, those dry granular media behaves either like solid or fluid. You again would probably experience this when you try to walk and like when you try to be gentle on the surface that you walk like on beaches, and when you try to basically like try to move slowly, it's kind of okay. You don't sink that much, but when you try to run, like even like try to climb like shallow hills, you basically sink a lot. Then it transitions to more like a fluid state in which that the material cannot sustain stress or like forces. Okay, so let's move along why we do this. So apparently space robotics, like Moon and Mars and all like extraterrestrial environments, basically consists of these like regolith, which is basically between powder and a few millimeter particle of like sand-like substrate. And planetary rovers is of great interest for like for various purposes, for designing robots that can manipulate the terrain and then move on these flowable and deformable surfaces, which basically consists of dry granular media. And another aspect of motivation is basically conquering harsh environments on Earth, basically for scientific measurements and other stuff. And finally, like apparently agricultural robotics, in which that the soil-like terrain, granular-like terrain is like pretty significant, consists of pretty significant interest for those guys who want to be robots that can move on soil-like surfaces. So, so to start off, I want to basically introduce a theory which is called resistive force theory, which is an attempt to model an intruder or like leg or wheel geometry, which can basically intrude into these granular media. So what happens is you basically assume that you have a sea leg, like a Rex robot, right? Or, you know, like a human or like a lizard leg, right? Which is like somehow complex. What resistive force theory does is it divides this guy into small plates, and then depending on the plate depth, orientation, as well as movement direction, you can basically get like, you know, have some experiments like this. You can penetrate this small plate, like a, you know, like some small part of this large intruder into a bed of, in this case, a dry grain media. In this case, this is a poppy seed, and then you can basically measure the forces. And by changing depth, orientation, as well as movement direction of this guy, you can basically get such a heat map for different angle of intrusion as well as angle of attack. And by superimposing, by basically varying it, you get that heat map. And basically by superimposing these little plate, the forces on these little plate elements based on orientation, depth, and movement direction, you can basically sum up all the forces of a body, a complex like body, that can move into granular, dry granular media. And you can, once you sum up, you can basically get really close to the experimental data. This theory is basically developed, I think, like during 50s or 60s for like for water, but Dan Goldman showed that this is like a better working scenario for granular media. So, and it's kind of universal, I want to say. You can see that like poppy seeds, like it's like, you know, the dash and the solid ones, they like match pretty well. And for closed pack poppy seeds, like loose pack poppy seeds, as well as smaller particle diameter particles like glass beads, and larger particle diameter glass beads. It's kind of universal, I would say. As long as you don't have cohesion between particles, they're dry and just like they only have contact forces. And as long as they're not powder, they kind of like, this RFT is kind of like a representative model. But there's catches, right? So vast number of particles basically make it really, really hard to model these interactions. So RFT is great, but it cannot capture interactions on slope in which that basically we are interested, because sand dunes and like these extraterrestrial spaces, they're not flat. They're like these small bumps, and like, you know, they're like small topologies everywhere, like ending up 25 to 30 degrees of slope going up and down. It's definitely not flat. And RFT cannot also capture very complex geometry interactions, as well as there's like geometry effects, there's shadowing effect, there's many effects that I don't want to talk about more here. So RFT is like kind of limited in what it can do. There is another method that people use, which is called continuum mechanics. Maybe some of you like from mechanical engineering might be like more familiar with this concept of continuum mechanics, frictional plasticity theory. I don't have a lot of background on this because I'm an electrical engineer, but from what I know, like by reading several papers, is that continuum mechanics can capture like these nasty, like, you know, regimes that RFT cannot, but it's like really costly. So the PDE, the partial differential equations, you need to solve like crazy. It takes a lot of time. So it's also not great. And you can do simulations, apparently. There are two ways of simulating these guys. First one is DEM. Again, it's great. You need to, it captures local dynamics, all these, you know, slopes and whatever interactions that you have with a really complex geometry. But it's, again, very slow. You need to rely on these, you know, HPC computing resources and stuff, because you need to model literally maybe billions of particles. On the other hand, there is FEM, finite element method, and it's quite fast, but it only gives you like global dynamics. It's not good at capturing local stuff. So what we do, given all these constraints, we basically, you know, like do good old experiments. We take the robot, we design the robot, and then we put it into the environment that, you know, which is tough to model and tough to basically work with. So this way of like systematic parameter investigation is what we do. And I will be talking more about this briefly. It is called robophysics approach. So we learn basically from failures. So what we do is with the robophysics approach is to span and investigate the parameters or variables of interest. And the successful robotic and biological locomotors modulate their gait behavior to induce solid-like or fluid-like responses depending on the configuration. And basically different than engineering approach in which that, you know, I'm also an engineer, but what engineers do is make robots robustly function despite their environment. So how you design a robot is to basically, you know, like put a lot of sensor modalities, put a lot of control, computation control onto the robot, and then move despite the environment. Here we take another approach, which is again robophysics. We basically aim to collaborate with the robot using minimal sensors, in some cases no sensor at all. But we don't use crazy control stuff, but we basically are inspired from animal motion, and animals doesn't also have crazy sensors and stuff. They have limited computation power, they have limited sensing, but they can do great if you compare their performance with robots. That's what basically we do. We are interested in robot failure rather than robot success. So as an engineering student, you're probably interested in optimizing some cost function or whatever, increasing reward function, right? That's what people do with machine learning hype these days and like these many years. That's great. As long as you know your environment, as long as you design a robot for rigid terrain, like, you know, like the pavements you've walked, right? But what happens when you don't know your reaction forces? When the terrain switches from solid to fluid region, and you don't know much about that. So what you do basically is learn from the failures. Instead of like focusing on this successes and optimization stuff, you basically focus on the failures. It's kind of like really frustrating. I was really frustrated at first because I was seeing the robot like fail, and then I was, oh no, that's not another failure again. But you know, Dan told me that, you know, it's basically it's more fascinating than something that you see something failure, because you now have the opportunity to see how it fails, and then next time you can build a better robot. That's the, you know, approach we try to at least take. You want to use robots not just as robots, not just like black boxes that we basically control with joysticks or with something else. We want to use robots as instruments to understand granular terrain interaction, not just some black box. And that's why we do all these systematic parameter investigations. And by the way, you can stop me if you have any questions. I'll be happy to answer. So this is my first robot on Goldman Lab. I wrote a postdoc, a TÜBİTAK postdoc project for this guy. And then what we were interested in was this basically walking kind of gait on extreme slopes. And the idea was basically using solid-like interaction instead of fluid-like one. And then to avoid unpredictable fail, flow, and avalanche down slopes. And another study I'll be talking about today is swimming-like motion. And instead of like going solid, if you're basically interested with this fluid-like motion, we have a small rover in our lab that we are interested in, and we are collaborating with Google Robotics to have this robot navigate on these extreme slopes. I'll be talking about more on this later. And finally, the last type of locomotion I want to talk is a little bit interesting one. It's growing robots, growing soft robots into this soft matter, which is basically inspired from plant root hairs, and we can have these robots grow crazy. I'll start off with granular slopes and why it is interesting. So it's a pretty challenging environment, as you would see here. Low yield stress, if you don't apply a lot of force, it's more like solid in the side parts here. But in the middle, once you basically, and it starts with a single particle. Once the single particles have enough velocity and energy, then it basically attracts the other particles in the vicinity, and then they create this beautiful, basically avalanching motion. And it's pretty challenging for robots, especially for Rex-like robots, because again, there is no set of equations like, you know, like Navier-Stokes. Like people have this equations, so they can build better planes, they can build better underwater robots, right, or like vessels or whatever. But here on dry granular media, you don't basically have these kind of equations. So again, you're like, you need to rely on like pure experiments, I would say, to get the best, interesting results. So, but before experiments, then, and his, like his postdocs and his like students, basically they take a snake robot, actual snake, not the snake robot. They take a snake and then have it like locomote on, this is 25 degrees, I guess, 25 degrees sandy slope. And then they realize that it does not do this undulatory motion, but it does this weird motion in which that it lifts it, like part of its body, like vertically lifts part of its body so that it can use its body to create leg-like motion. This is solidification, more like a solidification of a flowable slope. And how it shows it, and Dan Goleman and his students, basically, they created this snake robot, basically. And then they have it like, do this motion, which is called sidewinding. And then they were able to kind of replicate these guys' locomotion on 20 degrees. And another approach of solidification of slopes is the mud skipper robot that Dan Goleman just a decade ago developed in their lab, and it's inspired from this mud skipper animal, which is like ancestors of these transition animals that transit from seas to the land. But it has a interesting way of using its tail to locomote its body, and then using these flippers, basically, they can locomote on granular slopes. So the basic idea of doing these animal as well as robotic experiments is to get to this idea that try not to make a mess of the ground if you're on a highly flowable configuration. This is the key message of this slide. And when I end up in the lab, I realized that these robots can only get up to 20 degrees of slope. Okay, cool, and they also have a pretty large belly area, right? Their belly is very, very close to the granular surface, even though they're not trying to make a mass, but basically they do create a lot of mass of the terrain. So, and then I thought, can we do better? Can we just create another alternative way of facilitating limbs on granular slopes? And why not? And we had a bipedal robot. And the idea is that you have a bipedal robot is to have a robot that would basically work with a human being, because we're also bipeds. And there was also exploration, search and rescue, and construction, motivations. So historically, controlling bipedal robots has two mainstream methodologies. The first one is static walking. I think until 1990s or maybe even 2000, people basically work on this robot. Maybe you remember this ASIMA robot, which basically works on principle of support polygon, stable support polygon, which is ZMP method, in which that the center of mass, projection, vertical projection always aligns with this area basically. On the other hand, there is this, I think cooler walking robots nowadays, in the past 2 decades, dynamic walking, in which that humans are also dynamic walkers. We don't care about the center of mass. We basically fall until the next step because we can control, we have sensors, and we have so many, other stuff that we're allowed to do this, because our system allows us. This is great. So static gait is kind of super stable, but it's it's sluggish. It's not agile. It's pretty slow. On the other hand, dynamic gait, great, fast, but it's not that stable. So what do you do on rigid contact? You basically design dynamic walking robots. Cool, because we know the reaction forces. At least we have tools to predict the reaction forces, right? Using friction cones, using basically zero velocity at contact and stuff like that. But what happens when you don't know the reaction forces, like in granular terrain, especially on slopes? Basically, high speed ground contact with the granular surfaces leads to instant fluidization of the material, and that leads to sinking, slipping, and all nasty things that you would see in a robot. So, and this is a case that, retired. That's a retired Atlas robot failing on rubble, kind of like granular media on, I think not even 20 degrees, maybe 15 degrees. And it uses feedback control, evidently, It's hydraulic, it's retired, but it fails. And lack of equations predicting the phase transition between solid and fluid basically hinders using feedback mechanisms. So that's why we rely on open loop gates and quasi-static motion. When we basically, at least when we start to build robots which can navigate on granular slopes. So that's a Rex robot failing on, again, I think this is 2930 degrees. That's a desert slope. So okay, this is the robot that I worked with, and that's the RoboPhysical version of it. So we have a test bed which we can fluidize before each experiment, because once you do the experiment, it's not like hard ground. You need to reset the terrain. We have an air fluidization. We have these air blowers down there, and we use poppy seeds. I would assume you could ask why poppy seeds? Because if you were to use sand, it's like pretty straightforward, but sand gets into the actuators and then that screws the actuators up. So you can use, like actuators on sand a few times, not many. But when you crash poppy seeds, they basically turn this into oil. So it's harmless to your actuators. That's why we use poppy seeds. And it's kind of like a representative model for sand. So this is the biped robot. Here, it's kind of like a small guy, 40 centimeters, this big, and it's like 1.5 kg. And we basically use dynamic actuators and 3D printed links. So the first thing that when I started to do experiments with this robot, I realized that there are like two main problems. The first one is basically tilting and falling due to this unpredicted center of mass tracking, because you don't know on a rigid slope, you can basically track your center of mass, right? You know your length, you know the velocity, you can track it. But on granular slopes, since you don't know how you're gonna basically yield, you don't know, and it's really tough to track, and then you basically tilt and fall. And the other part was, if you're lucky to end up having a step, you can, and there are times that you basically end up taking a step forward. But what happens is, since you cannot directly control your center of mass, you basically shove your foot in and then you tilt back again. These are the basic problems in these two separate phases of bipedal walking. And unlike hard ground, basically the stability region on deformable surfaces is like super detrimental to locomotion. And what we did was basically what we thought was, let's just do something that's gonna prevent the robot to tilt back and forth, regardless of how you take a step. So what we did was this: we take a robot and assume that it is it's an inverted pendulum, but it's perfectly aligned with gravity. Regardless of the step you take, we design a zero moment point gate that allows the center of mass to remain exactly straight to the gravity, regardless of the slope, so that basically whatever you do with your step, it's not tilting back and forth. So it does not create any moment on the foot levels. No moment on ankle, so that you don't tilt at all. So this is the single support phase. So we constrain zero moment point region during single support phase, and during double support phase, what we do is we propel the body. Now we have more support area. We basically propel the body forward, and then we basically do this iteratively. So these are two videos. I think I should be able to play those. Okay, these are two videos that showing the robot that basically walks on kind of extreme, like 20-ish degrees, you see here. And it can walk, okay, this line shows that achieved versus targeted, in which that I want to achieve, say, 1 meter of distance, right? But I just measure after whatever steps that I get like 90 centimeters. So that means that I have a 0.9 success, or 0.1 person, 0.1 failure, whatever. So this is this line shows a slipless locomotion that you basically want to achieve. So plus and minus 10 is kind of okay, but regardless, whatever I tried, I always end up slipping down around 20 degrees. So that means that why? Because the friction coefficient between the poppy seeds and the foot surface, 3D printed foot surface, limits you to 90 degrees. 19 degrees. So that's why, unless you don't do crazy stuff with many sensors, maybe, I don't know, that's like our initial investigations that showed us friction is an element that limits the robot performance. What we did next is, inspired from soccer players and turtle fins and stuff, we basically, I 3D printed a plate and I measured the forces as I poke it in and drag along the surface. And these are a few force measurement profiles that you see. What I'm interested in is this peak intrusion force at the end of intrusion and initial drag force at the start of drag. So what I want to do is I want to place many plates at the foot sole so that I can use my foot like as if they are my hands. I want to climb like by basically clinging onto the surface. And so as you would see here, as a function of depth, the intrusion resistance is kind of linear-ish, monotonically increasing, and the drag force, initial drag resistance that I create with those plates increase more and more like a quadratic relation. That means that you want to place your plates as deep as you can. That is the message. And next step, I start with a single one, and then I 3D printed twin plates having 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 centimeter distance. And then I repeated that. I measured the maximal force during intrusion and maximum force change during drag. And as you would see here, you know, on an ideal scenario, you don't want to create a lot of force while you are engaging with the terrain because you don't want to switch from solid to fluid regime, right? So we want to avoid this, guys. And once you place your cleats, you want to create a lot of traction force so that you don't basically slip down. And we want to be basically right here. Minimal resistance to intrusion and maximal resistance during drag. So this basically shows that intruders do not collaborate. They don't create these nasty forces when they're like 4 or 5 centimeters apart. Basically this guy here, or like maybe the other one. So then I take this 4 centimeter apart cleats, if you will, I call them cleats or plates, whatever you want to say. I can now walk not only on 20 degrees, pretty good. I can also walk on like extreme slopes, which is 30 degrees. You might think that, okay, why there is not 40 degrees? Why there is not 60 degrees, whatever, right? You cannot get that many degrees with these dry granular media because the friction forces between these particles basically tells you that you can only get up until I think 32 or 33 degrees. You cannot get more than that because you start to tilt your bed more than 32, 33 degrees, regardless of there is a robot or not, it starts to avalanche down. So this is the extreme slopes that these guys can walk, and they're like a few quick calculations show that I need at least 3 cleats per foot, and they should be like 4 or 5 centimeters apart. And when I do that, oops, just run these manually. And when I do that, basically, I want to show that having a lot of cleats, not great. Having, not enough cleats, also not great. There is this sweet spot, and when you hit that sweet spot, basically, you can get your robots walk up pretty nicely by basically making and breaking contact without exceeding yield stress and creating tractive forces via appropriate cleat spacing. So this is the bipedal robot that I've done. So this, we're in the process of doing more experiments and sending it to some robotics journals. And I'll be switching to different strategy, which is basically swimming like motion. So this is an actual footage from, I think, Spirit, 14 years ago, 15 years ago. And that shows the failure of the rover wheel. So the rover encountered a very loose material, very loose state material, and then it kind of entrapped. It's like a swamp, but a dry one. You try harder, you sink down. So that's kind of the problem. And another, on top of this, crater pose for challenges. They're scientists are especially interested in craters because when you have a slope on the, I don't know its scientific name, but on this, shadow part, there could be water. and it's like, I think it's somehow like very interesting. Also like these here, like, you know, the middle part is also of interest because if scientists can get here and get samples, they can have more information about the of the planet's internal structure for some reason that I don't entirely know. But I know that rovers cannot come even close to these craters because of the slopes and things. So again, NASA guys developed a rover, like, again, I think this is 2015 or 16, a rover which is called Resource Prospector, and instead of like regular like conventional wheel spinning, they have this wiggling motion, as you would see. They kind of swim. And what our lab did before my time is that they took they 3D printed basically a smaller, a lab scale version of this rover, and then they have it fail, and then they basically repeated that cyclical kind of swimming motion that I'll be talking about more. And they just like published it, I think 2020 in Science Robotics. So this is the motion that this rover does is called rear rotator pedaling, in which that the rear legs is used in an unconventional way, in which that you kind of like create this swimming kind of sweeping motion. And mini rover can lift and reset the wheel, alternating between only the rear wheels, while each wheel basically spins at a certain speed. So just run this.
What's the difference between this and the NASA?
So this is not RRP, this is RS motion. This is rotary sequence. Oops. So as you would see here, all of the wheels are kind of like wiggling, see? So all of the wheels wiggling is not great. No, if you read this paper, you're gonna see that, and we can talk more about this. Just basically spinning the real, like sweeping the rear wheels, while just spinning the front wheels actually gets you more speed and gets you more stable motion. And this is, again, this is human made, and you can basically see that this rover can like locomote on slopes like 20, even like 25, 26 degrees by creating this intermediate mound and pushing that mound backward gradually. It can swim in a localized frictional fluid. And you can call dry granular media frictional fluid. You know, it's like a very good definition. So this is all great, and this is me walking in Qatar deserts, and all the gates that I find, or like the other guys find and publish in cool journals, they're like all made like human made, right? So the patterns of gates we found basically with human intuition and testing. It took like months and years in some cases. It's not super scalable. So I get to drive through Qatar deserts and then like, you know, just do this crazy stuff myself, and then it's not certain scale. So what we want to do is we wish to learn strategies that utilize terrain, robot, or locomotor, if you will, coupling in flowable terrains. So we used Bayesian optimization for initial learning schemes of RRP states. So the thing is, RRP is great, but the rover is great, but there is so many degrees of freedom. It's like it takes a lifetime maybe for one to develop all these strategies, right? So what we do is we basically use optimization to gain insight into developing RRP motion. So this is the human RRP, which was published in Science Robotics. And this is the Bayesian optimization RRP we find, which is basically roughly like 10 times faster, 9 to 10 times here, like this, like 5 times faster on the specific slope. And the optimized steps, basically, there's some differences that I don't want to talk too much because, you know, due to the time limit that I have. But if you wanna go and check, we published this in AIS 2 years ago, and we're still working more on this, and I'll be talking about that. So Bayesian optimization. So all the robots that our lab has basically great at going straight, right? And we wanted the rover to turn on slopes, not just like go straight, but do these maneuvering motions. So our objective was we trained Bayesian optimization to have the rover to turn 90-ish degrees on 25 slope. And you see here, Bayesian optimization learned 2 distinct strategies, terrain manipulation strategies. The first one is differential spin or tank turning, if you will. The wheels on the right goes forward, the wheels on the left basically goes backward. And the second strategy was using the single RRP. You see on the right hind wheel basically does this single RRP. So it would take, again, like a lot of time for optimization to find the really optimal gate. And maybe if you're stuck in local minima, you wouldn't basically understand. And experimentation takes a lot of time. So what we did is we used human intuition to enhance machine learned gates. Here you see we optimized. Again, I don't want to talk too much details on this, but if you're interested, we can talk offline. So what we did is we further optimized using human systematic investigation. We look at the failures, we look at the successes, and then we change some parameters. We basically applied robophysics into the machine learned gates. And then we have the robot to turn 90 degrees in just like 4.5 seconds. It's like 2 cycles. And we published this in ICRA 2024 that I will be presenting tomorrow online. It's basically in Japan, but I just wanted to come to Turkey. So you can basically see the difference, like performance difference. This is the initial gate that we fed to optimizer, and it can get to 90 degrees like about more than 2 minutes. And then these like suboptimal gates kind of get you to turning not bad, but it kind of like saturates after a while. And this guy, like human plus machine kind of collaboration gate, get us to turn like really fast. And then we basically, by changing the differential spin speed of the rover, we can basically get to whatever degree we want. And these are all open loop gates. There is no feedback. And I will tell you more why we don't feed, why basically we just like stick to open loop gates. And you can basically see linear-ish gates here. So, okay, these are all related with walking and swimming, maybe like kind of intuitive, but I'll be presenting a non-intuitive way of navigating granular terrains. Instead of like locomoting on it, we are locomoting in it. So, and we are inspired from nature. So plant root hairs, as you probably know, they're specialized cells located near the tip of the plant's root, right? So their biological role, you probably also know, that absorb water and minerals from soil as well as enlarge surface area. However, there is this physical role of these guys, and they anchor the plant during growth. So this small guy starts from a seedling, just a small piece, and you don't apply external forcing to it, but somehow it finds its way towards the terrain, deeper depths, and then it can stabilize the plant's trunk while doing this. And also, like, there's this external stuff, there's this external wind, it can resist to external disturbances as well. So they're basically doing a great job to anchor the plant and get all these water and minerals and stuff like that. But people, they don't basically know much about the density of these hairs, why they choose to be this dense. And you might, from your childhood, you might remember that when you try to yank some tiny plants, right, some grass, it's like really hard. And people don't know much about this. And we wanted to investigate this, and we're interested in modeling of growing plant root hairs inspired structures into soft matter, like dry granular media. So actually there's an interesting study done on maize roots, like corn, this like I think corn. Yeah. So like 2016, they just like grew some corn roots, and then they pulled them out. And during pull out or like uprooting, they show that the wild type, which is basically the plant root which has hairs, can mobilize many soil particles around in the vicinity as compared to the hairless mutant. And they quantify it by basically showing that the max plot force during pullout for wild type is much more than the hairless version. But the density of these hairs, they're not basically known. They're not, I can confidently say that it's underexplored. And we are interested in exploring that region, but there's some catches, as you would assume, probably. First off, plants, they don't grow in dry granular media, right? They grow in wet, cohesive, and heterogeneous soil, as you probably know. But doing these kind of experiments, controlling all these complex entities in a lab environment is like really, I don't want to say hard, but it's not easy. It's for sure not easy. And even creating digital models in digital environment for these stuff is even harder. So what we turn to do is basically turn our focus to dry friction-dominated granular media. Is a good candidate for representing the multi-phase characteristics of this granular-like soil. And we use, we would love to do experiments again. I'm an experimentalist, I would say. But again, experiments give you global information, give you forces. And if you're lucky, you can get some PIV, like, some images, some displacement vector. But you don't know what's really going on with the hairs and its visibility. So if you have a good simulation environment, you can basically visualize and quantify particle physics locally. And we use a software, open source software, which is called LAMPS, and we use finite size particles. We use normal tangential rolling interactions, and finally we use millions of these particles. And thanks to cloud computing, we can now do these simulations in basic hours. First off, you don't just start with an experiment. Simulation seems to be pretty easy, but it's not easy. So what you do is you need to just calibrate or validate the simulation environment. So what we did was I 3D printed this guy, a cylindrical shape, and then poke it in and then measure the forces. This is the 6-axis ATI force sensor we use. And then I created this this guy in a simulation environment, and I poked that in. And then I matched the experiment and simulation as a function of intruder's depth, and I was able to play with all these contact model parameters and get this nice fitting. So once we did that, we were confident the results that we are going to get with the simulation is going to be at least somehow comfortable to be believed in. So the next part is, once we're okay with the simulation environment, we wanted to grow structures, and it's not easy to grow structures. It's not like, we just connect some springs and stuff. What we did is, after so many experiments, I realized that it's best to start with a rigid body composed of many rigid rings. So it's like kind of bracelets, if you will, but stacked on, stacked really close. And what you do is you basically, this is polymerized rigid body, packed rigid rings. So what we do is we partially depolymerize from the top. We create basically here 2 rigid bodies, the first ring at the top and the rest. And then we create bonds between them and we elongate the bonds. And you basically do it in a loop, continue to depolymerize the rigid root cap, and then you basically gradually increase bonds and grow. The one on the right you see is a growing scheme starting from scratch, just like packed particles being unpacked gradually, making it to a growing scheme. So then we introduce hairs. So this is the primary root, and these are like the hairs. This is the cross-sectional view, and we have this. I don't want to get into too much details about these dimension stuff. It's like pretty small, but it's kind of like doing its job. And we grow them, we wait a little, and then we pull them out. As you would see, the growing forces are kind of like small because we use hairs, basically. And when I try to pull it out, a lot of force. And we then investigated this visually, and we plotted the displacement factors of these guys. And you can see that during plots, more particles are kind of like engaged or recruited, if you will, when you have a good hair spacing, like the cleats in the bipedal robot, kind of relevant. And we wanted to further quantify this, and we varied the hair spacing, vertical hairs, starting from infinity, infinity hair spacing with 2 hairs, meaning like no hairs at all. This is a no hair scenario, right? We gradually increase hair density, and then we basically can see when we get to around like 0.5 to 1 centimeter hair spacing, we have many anchoring forces during pull-out. And we can basically, and then we visualize this by plotting 3D shear strain during pull-out. This is 0, this is like no hair scenario, this guy, and this is a lot of hairs, and this is a lot of hairs, 0 millimeter apart, and this is basically this guy. I should put an arrow to this, and this guy kind of creates an escalator of particles, trying to resist the pull-out motion, while these two, they don't basically they're not good at recruiting particles. So the gist is, if you can recruit particles in a proper spacing, you can increase you can jack up your anchoring force. This is kind of like the key message of this slide. So applications, okay, great. So we have some insight into biology, that's fine, but since I'm an engineer, I want to basically utilize these principles in actual robots. So this is a vine robot, kind of like in Turkish sarmaşık, inspired from vines, and it's a published paper. But what we do is, this is hairless vine published in Science Robotics. We're basically introducing these kind of optimally spaced hairs, as you see up here, and then we're basically anchoring these guys in. And you can see here that if there is hair, just any tiny bit hair, I don't remember the actual spacing of this guy. If you compare these two, negative blue as well as negative reddish plus, when there's hairs, you can basically recruit a lot of particles, and you can increase the friction between those particles. You have many anchoring force. So that's why plants love creating these hairs. So this is, I think, my last. Yes. Okay. In conclusion, in dry granular media, organisms can use solid or fluid-like properties to walk, swim, and even grow. Right. So we explored various gate schemes and appendage designs for the robophysical models to exploit the multi-phase feature of granular media. In a bipedal robot, we developed a new gate trajectory and cleat geometry that facilitates low slip locomotion on extreme granular slopes. In a mini rover, we combined both machine learning and human learning, basically, to enable robust and fast maneuvering. And finally, we recapitulated the finding that the plant root hairs enhance anchoring by increasing soil recruitment through simulations and some experiments. And I'd like to thank my collaborators as well as the funding agencies, and I'll be happy to take your questions.